We good, Han? Okay. Thank you for joining us for the first annual Montana Kidlit Festival. I am Precious McKenzie from Rocky Mountain College, and I am the festival chair and the moderator for this session. Just a few items before we get started. The Montana Kidlit Festival is sponsored by Humanities Montana, the Billings Public Library, the Writer's Voice, this House of Books, and Rocky Mountain College. So thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't have done this without you. Our sessions will be photographed and recorded for Community Channel 7, and they might be shared on social media and in the press. Before you leave today, please visit the book sales table and support our Montana writers and illustrators. They appreciate your support. And thank you, Julie, from this House of Books, for being here for the festival. And our writers and illustrators will also autograph your books for you, too. And be sure to pick up a ticket for your chance to win the door prizes. All right, so let's get started. I am delighted to introduce you to LuAnn Rod. Growing up on a dairy farm in Minnesota, LuAnn Rod had three loves: reading, writing, and horses. That hasn't changed except for the additions of a husband, son, and daughter-in-law, one big cat, and three crazy dogs. Her reading list tends toward titles with plucky heroines and heroes, adventure with a generous dollop of humor, and heartfelt friendships, both animal and human. Home is in the Gallatin Valley, where she is an active member of the Dog Agility Club and is learning to herd sheep with her littlest shepherd, Max. She also participates on her Arabian horses in endurance rides. All of this is to say she's an animal lover and loves to share that world with others. LuAnn earned her bachelor's degree in English literature through Montana State University and worked 25 years in the newsroom at her local newspaper. Her novel, Maddie McDowell and the Rodeo Robbery, was published in June of 2021 by Chicken Scratch Books. So without further ado, welcome, LuAnn. We're happy to have you.
So, as you've heard, my name is LuAnn Rod, and I'm the author of Maddie McDowell and the Rodeo Robbery. This is a novel set in 1919 during the golden age of rodeo. First off, thank you for the introduction. Just a little bit more about that is that I've lived in Montana for more than 40 years and in the Gallatin Valley during that entire time. I was an editor of the entertainment section at the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, and I also wrote columns and feature pieces, and I worked on fiction in my spare time. And to this day, I do proofreading for a couple of publishers, so trying to keep my fingers on the keyboard really busy. So Maddie is my first published book, and it came out in June of last year. Published by Chicken Scratch Book, a newer Montana publisher located in Wisdom, Montana. It publishes original middle grade novels and develops literature study programs for each books. They aim their market in part toward homeschool households, small schools, and teachers and librarians, as well as parents and middle graders. The publisher, Kiri Jordan, also has informative blogs for readers and writers, as well as courses for writers. And if you'd like to know more, you can go to chickenscratchbooks.com, or if you have questions, I can cover them at the end of the program. I'm also proud to say that Maddie has been named a finalist for this year's Spur Award in the juvenile fiction category by the Western Writers of America. And it was a huge surprise, and I'm very honored for that. Let's see if I can work this. This is a different computer for me. So let's learn a little bit more about the time. The year was 1919, and cowgirls ruled. They trick rode, they raced, they rode bucking horses, they were young, and they had dreams. So my book falls under the category of historical fiction. The phrase seems to me to be a bit contradictory. History is about truth and fiction is made up. So finding the balance between truth and fiction can be a tricky thing, but it is important. Oops, sorry, went back one. go. So, what is historical fiction? If you go to an online library and plug in historical fiction, the variety, trying to get this to work here. The variety of books that come up is vast. Titles as different as Da Vinci's Cat, a time-slip fantasy by Catherine Gilbert Murdoch, to War and Millie McGonigal by Karen Cushman, which is a realistic story of a young girl growing up in California during World War II. Or you can find books as different as Kent Davis's A Riddle and Ruby series, a fantastical alternative history, all the way to A Boy Called Dickens, the story of the historical figure and writer Charles Dickens, written as a child by John Hendricks. So to be labeled historical fiction, there are only a few simple characteristics. First and foremost, historical fiction is a story that's set at least 30 years in the past. It requires both research and imagination on the part of the writer to tell the story, and it may or may not include an historical event or person. After that, it's pretty much wide open and a place to let your imagination graze. In my case, the characters are all made up, but based on research into the real era. And while I'm not a historian, I tried to paint a picture with accurate details and most importantly, with the spirit of the time and place. But first, I had to have an idea. Ideas come from anywhere. You have to open yourself up to them. You get ideas from the people you meet, the books you read, the places you go, the hobbies you enjoy. Ideas blow in with the wind when you least expect it, and it doesn't have to be a big idea. A very tiny one will do. Then it's a matter of building it into a story that speaks to you and for you. I created Maddie from a story a neighbor told me. I ride my horse on my neighbor's ranch and used to stop and visit with a lady named Myrtle who loved to chat about her love of horses. She'd grown up in the area on various ranches and always had a funny story to tell about her childhood. So one time when I stopped, she told me the story about going into Bozeman to the rodeo and seeing cowgirls riding horses in the rodeo for the first time. She was so impressed that when she got home, she marched upstairs, packed a bag, and was headed out the door. And when she got down, her mother stopped her at the door and said, "Where do you think you're going, young lady?" And she said, "I'm going to go join the rodeo." So that image of that plucky young Montana girl stuck in my head, and I thought there's got to be a story in there somewhere. And the next sign that sent me down this path was this image on the left-hand side here. It's by artist Beth Lofton. I saw the poster in a gallery in Bozeman and it immediately said to me, that's my character, that's Maddie. Maybe not exactly, but there's a spirit in that picture that to me is the essence of my character. And this picture hangs in my office as a constant inspiration to writing about Maddie and her adventures. And the picture next to it is Cowgirl Hall of Famer Vera McGinnis. And this is a few years later, and I imagine Maddie growing into this cowgirl. And it's another inspiration that made Maddie very real to me. And she is very real to me. So I had an idea. I didn't start out with the intention to write a historical novel. I started out with a story to tell, or more accurately, a character to share. She could have lived in many decades in the West or right now. She's a character that I believe embodies a smart, funny, adventurous, and brave girl of any era. But I chose to set the book in the period near the beginning of the sport of rodeo, in part because I was interested in the early cowgirls and admired them. They were some of the first professional women athletes in this country, and I wanted to know more about them. And in part because I grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota longing to be a cowgirl. That was my dream. So to get to know Maddie a little bit more, I'd like to read you just a little bit from the first chapter. I knew saving a life might very well be the end of mine, but I had to do it. The little gray body shot across the wooden floor, under desks, under pointed-toed shoes, and under wool skirts. I looked left and right. My classmates' eyes were on the front of the classroom, and I sat at a desk in the back corner where the miscreants, lazy, and/or unacceptable students were sent. Mrs. Snyder, our school's principal, thought it was punishment. For me, the fresh air from the nearby window washed away the odor of supposed young ladies living in too close quarters with too few wash days in the week. It was worth calling Tessie Turner a bold-faced skunk to be marched back to my favorite desk and a brief whiff of freedom, like a crisp spring breeze from the bluff overlooking my family's Montana ranch. And that just may have saved the life of the poor mouse. The last rodent brave enough to cross the floor in the 6th grade classroom was brought down by a sharp heel from Constance Purdy. I couldn't let that happen again. It was just trying to escape. What critter in its right mind would willingly enter Mrs. Snyder's school for young ladies? Not me. Anyway, with the class's attention on the front board and Miss Hanson scratching Latin phrases in her oh-so-precise, painfully slow hand, I figured I could scooch across the back of the room and shoo Mr. Mouse into the corner where I knew there was a hole in the floor. He'd be safe. I'd be exposed for being out of my seat, and that would mean a visit to Mrs. Snyder's office. But like old Joe always told me, you can't rope a calf unless you throw the loop. I threw the loop and started to scooch. "A mouse!" screamed Tessie. 15 supposed young ladies clambered onto desks, shrieking as if a tiger escaped from the circus and prowled the classroom. Constance flew toward the back, heels clattering. I dove toward little Mousie, frozen by the sudden interruption of his journey. After all, he was probably just heading home to take a nap. I scooped him up in my hands, stuffed him into my skirt's pocket, and still had time to look as innocent as the green grass. Maybe it was sitting on the floor that gave me away. The classroom door flew open, banging against the wall, shaking the pictures of the school's benefactors, sourpuss old ladies and angry-looking men. "You again," Mrs. Snyder shouted. "Madeline McDowell, to your room, immediately. Stay there until you are called for." I rose from my seat on the floor and patted my pocket. Mr. Mouse was a soft, warm lump. I smiled and walked past her, as ladylike as a ranch-raised young girl could. "Mrs. Snyder," Constance called just as I reached the door. "Miss McDowell has a mouse in her pocket, a dirty mouse." I felt my ear grabbed and shaken. "Dispose of it. There will be no dinner tonight, and you are confined to your room until further notice. Do you understand, Miss McDowell?" "Yes." "What did you say?" "Yes, Mrs. Snyder." And, "Thank you, Mrs. Snyder." So I hope the first pages set the period in the early part of the 1900s. That wasn't my era, but with small details that added but didn't draw away from the story, my hope is the reader is squarely in the historic period. I didn't know a lot about the time, so I had to learn. These things I didn't know when I started. Things like what was going on in 1919 in America, in the world, in Montana, in rodeo specifically. I needed to have a feel for the appropriate language. Maddie calling something cool was a no-brainer, but what would she say? Visualizing what people wore and how rodeos were organized was really important because rodeo of the time was very different from today. So I had the idea and a character that was growing. I had a setting that I wanted to explore, so that brings me to research. The story is fictional, and you don't want the setting to become more important than the character or her story, but you do need details. You do need to place your character deeply into the period. You need research. There we go. My research included nonfiction books about early cowgirls and rodeo to learn what was possible and what wasn't. I wanted to make sure that Maddie at 12, nearly 13, could possibly have competed in rodeo. I looked at original documents like these newspaper pages from the Bozeman Courant from right around 1919. I learned that there really were young boys and girls that performed in rodeos. In one newspaper article, I learned that the star of a Bozeman rodeo event, actually called the Bozeman Roundup at the time, was a 9-year-old girl riding her father's string of thoroughbreds in the cowgirl relay race. And there were more. One notable story is Montana Hall of Fame cowgirl Fanny Sperry Steele, who's on the rearing horse. She is said to have been 14 in her first public rodeo, riding broncs against adult men. This picture is at age 16 in Winnipeg, Canada, where she was defending her first women's championship title. So that would mean when she won the first time she was actually 15, it was the year before. Then there's the famous Montana cowgirl Alice Greeno. This picture is taken when she's 10 years old in the left-hand corner with the rope, learning her skills. The Greenos were, and I believe still are, a famous rodeo family from Red Lodge, Montana, and she and her sister Marge performed in rodeos all over the world during the late 20s and 30s. At the bottom here on the left with the horse, you see, with the hugging the horse, you see Lucille Mulhall. She was 12 when she rode in her father's Wild West show in Madison Square Garden. And the term cowgirl is said to have been coined by President Theodore Roosevelt after he watched her roping cattle when she was in her teens. And then the last picture is Ruth Parton with her string of thoroughbred racehorses. She's 17 in this picture, but she was already a seasoned champion in the relay races, competing against men and women. So one of Maddie's character traits is her use of language, particularly idioms. Let's just call it gentle cussing. Some words she's prone to, like thunderation and tarnation, were in common usage at the time. So whenever it was appropriate for Maddie to have a strong comment, I did an internet search to make sure that it was something that was in usage at the time. And sometimes, because she uses strong language a lot, I ran out of the things that were appropriate, so I just had to start making stuff up. And one of the hardest parts in the research was getting the rodeo setting right. Some descriptions that I came across were clear and some weren't clear at all, or even contradictory. And the fact is that rodeos weren't all the same. It depended on the location and the size of the rodeo. So it turned out that pictures, and there were a lot of postcards at that time, pictures of the rodeo were the best ideas of what was actually happening. So on the top left, it's a rodeo parade, which was real common. Most rodeos had a rodeo parade. You can see there's a city band marching. You can see there's a troop of Native American riders. And then down in the corner there with the trick roping, you can also see, besides him actually doing a trick that I wanted to describe, you can also see the stadium in back and the crowd. And then right next to it is a grand entry. And I'm going to be here. Is a grand entry with all the competitors. And that picture, I believe, was taken in Miles City. You can see how many competitors there actually are. And then you can see that huge stadium. And this would have been, and I'm not sure the date on, 1911, I think the date on that photo says. So in Bozeman, the first Bozeman Roundup was in 1919, and the paper reported that they had a crowd of 10,000 spectators that came to Bozeman for the event. So these were really big deals. They were a big part of a community's their advertisement, and they're trying to get a tourist trade to come in. So by looking at all these pictures, you get an idea of how the things were run and what details I could actually use and document. And if I couldn't find documentation of something that I thought might have happened, I just didn't use it for the most part. And as far as clothing goes, it was important to get that right. You can see the detail on the dress up there. That was worn by Juanita Perry, a Hall of Fame cowgirl. It's a split skirt, which would have been worn at the time of 1919. You can see it just barely, but it is a split skirt. It looks like it's probably made of leather. It's got fringes. It's beaded. It has a lot of detail. And you can see how tiny she must have been. And things were changing very fast. It was the end of the Great War, World War I, and the US was in a very actively changing world. It was important to me that the clothing was actually being worn by the rodeo people at that time. And fashions were evolving really quickly. So if my references said that an article of clothing wasn't introduced until 1925, I didn't use it. Here you can see the difference a few years made in the styles of the clothing worn by the competitors. On the left here is Prairie Rose Henderson, and she was known for her flamboyant style, including feathers and beading. I have one picture of her with a great big old ostrich feather coming out of her hat. On the center photo is a more utilitarian dress, also circa 1919. And only a few years later, 1922, in this picture of trick riders, you can see the tight legs. And it was a costume that was developed to make the dangerous sport just a little bit safer. And from this period on, the pants became pants instead of the split skirt. What the cowgirls wore were actual pants. And rodeo itself was very different from today. There were very few standardized rules. Rodeo was different from town to town. Sometimes it was in an arena, sometimes it was in an open field surrounded by cars and wagons. The events were different. Bucking horses didn't come out of chutes. You can see in this far side here. They didn't come out of chutes, they were blindfolded and snubbed up to another horse, and the rider mounted in the middle of the arena. In this photo, which looks like a pretty bad situation starting, the caption reads, "She rode him." And then trick roping was also an exhibition, was both an exhibition and an event. Up you see Florence Ledoux spinning a rope while on the ground, making it look easy, which it's not. I tried. And then you can also see that's Lucille Mulhall roping a moving horse and cowboy all at the same time. And roping was Lucille Mulhall's specialty. It's what she's very known for. Trick riding was also either an exhibition or oftentimes a competition. And this is a picture of the wildest race that I could even imagine. It's Roman riding, 2 horses, no saddle, full run around a track. And the winner in front is Tilly Baldwin, a Cowgirl Hall of Famer. And the 2 men behind, I believe, fell off before they hit the end. And since writers read, turning to nonfiction accounts, biography, and autobiography, collections of stories both from the time and even the life of ranch women and rodeo performers today, you can fill in blanks that become important to the authenticity of the work. There are details in first-person accounts, biographies, and well-researched social histories that you just can't find anywhere else. And while my story is fictional, taking those details and that I found in research and piecing together, I tried to piece together a little bit of what you might see if you could go back in time and go to a rodeo in 1919. But there were times when something I wanted to do, I couldn't really document, and I wasn't sure if it had actually happened that way. And this is an example of when I kind of broke the rule. I have a couple of Arabian horses, and I did as a kid as well. So for me, it was natural to slip one into the story. But they were uncommon in the US in the early part of the 1900s, and I wasn't sure if any had been used in rodeos. I knew that trick riders, would pick flashy looking horses, pintos, palominos, grays, horses that drew the eye of the judge and the spectators. And so I imagined that an Arabian would fit that bill very well, and I was bound and determined to put it in. But I still didn't know whether it was ever even possible. Then recently I came across this picture, and this was after the book was completely written and to the publisher, proving that my guess was possible. This is Mabel Strickland on her Arabian trick horse performing a hippodrome stand. Trick riding, and this trick in particular, has a part in my story, as well as an Arabian horse. And by the way, I also learned that Mabel was a very young cowgirl, having debuted at age 13 in her first rodeo. So the research is fun, but all good things eventually come to an end. And with the era firmly in the head and the mind, the writer has to go back to the story and characters and put them foremost. The story is part that becomes personal, that takes on a life all its own within that historic background. When I first started writing fiction, I would get really frustrated because people would always say, write what you know. My interpretation of that was, I don't know anything, or at least I wasn't an expert, so how could I possibly write? What did I have to say? Eventually, I realized I actually know a lot. I know a lot about living on this earth. I know a lot about being a person, feeling, laughing. I have interests that I can share, and I don't have to be an expert. And as a result, I can't write a story without bleeding a little. I have to draw on what I know personally to understand and empathize with the character's inner motives and the things that drive her. The things I needed to draw on for this book were pretty simple, but helped me understand my character's motivations. Things like hobbies, friendship, humor, and yes, even sadness. But since Maddie is a fun story overall, I drew heavily on my being a horse crazy kid and the love I have for riding. When Maddie makes a friend, well, that's something we can all relate to, whether we are young or old. I've always been a dog person, and our horse club went to rodeos when I was a kid. And even now, I remember being a kid and having a fortunate childhood, and to one that I still like to live in occasionally. And I found myself falling back on memories of very particular times. Since I wasn't about to go out and try to ride a bucking horse or jump off my horse at a dead run to know how it felt, I had to fall back onto relatable experiences that gave me certain emotions and feelings and put that into certain scenes. For the reader, it becomes more about Maddie's feelings, emotions, the exhilaration of riding a bronc, rather than the actual technical how do you do it skills. I wasn't a rodeo kid, but I was a horse show kid. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. But I do remember the first time I rode in the Minnesota Hippodrome, which is a huge arena, and it was filled with people. And we had more than 100 4-H'ers at the state horse show, and I took a 4th place. I also still ride, sometimes faster than I should, and in places I shouldn't. And I know the feeling of excitement and danger of knowing that my horse taking a bad step is not going to be a good thing. And having wound up on the ground more than once, I felt my heart in my throat, the adrenaline pumping, knowing I had a very close call. So along with watching videos of trick riders and rough stock riders, as well as having gone to many a rodeo, these experiences helped me write what I hoped would be believable scenes that had emotional impact, something history books couldn't describe. And lest we forget Maddie's partner in crime, Ivan the Bulldog, I do know how it feels to have a canine friend that is exasperating and lovable all at the same time. I love the dog scenes. I think of my dogs now and ones I've had in the past as being comedians there to entertain me. And I spend a lot of time trying to figure them out and what they're thinking, to no avail. So when Maddie needed a partner, it had to be a dog. Ivan was inspired by an old book, Beautiful Joe by Marshall Saunders, published in 1893. It's the dog version of Black Beauty, and it's the story of a beautiful soul in a scarred bulldog's body. I I'd like to read you just a little bit of when Maddie met Ivan. Ivan is a huge part of the heart of this book, I think. And this is early on in the book. And Maddie is in the process of escaping Mrs. Snyder's school for young ladies by hanging out the window on a rope of bed sheets. Security in the form of Sergeant O'Hara is in place. Sure enough, O'Hara's hat tipped over his eyes, and his snore sounded like a nicely rounded pig after his evening meal. It's no wonder the soldiers going by couldn't rouse him. I tiptoed past. The gate latch slipped up quietly. The wrought iron hinges opened. Screech! I froze, looking toward O'Hara, barely 10 feet away, his chair still propped back against the wall. Snore, burp, and a wet bubble dripped down the side of his grizzly chin. I stuffed my felt hat snugly on my head and took off at a run to the train station, my satchel in hand with only the essentials: another pair of dungarees and a plain cotton shirt, a tan split skirt, my silk blouse with the fringe, and the usual unmentionables. I already wore my broken-in riding boots. I thought I was on my way, that nothing could go wrong. I'd forgotten about the butcher's dog living next door. What was he doing awake? Thunder raced into heaven and back. Ivan cleared his master's fence with the grace of a charging bull, his red tongue lolling, his teeth glistening. Of course, I'm only imagining that part because I was too busy saving my hide to look. All I really knew was he was after me, baying, announcing to the world, Maddie McDowell has escaped the corral. Next thing I heard was O'Hara yelling, "Get that brat!" Excuse me. I kept running. I heard the dog panting, his nails scratching the pavement with each stride. Luckily, he wasn't that fast, being of a bulky build. I hit the intersection at Main and turned left toward the railway station. A green truck stood along the curb, its driver loading bottles of milk into its canvas-covered back. He slammed the rear gate closed and hopped into the driver's seat. I ran as if my life depended on it. Flying across the street, I aimed directly for the truck, eyes focused on the gate. The driver ground into gear. Black smoke billowed out the exhaust. Just as I jumped, the truck jerked forward. My feet dragged on the pavement as I half ran, half flew through the air. The driver gunned the engine and shifted gears to go faster. I felt a heavy weight pull on my dungarees. If it hadn't been for the twine I'd tied around the waist, they'd be yanked plumb off. Ivan's grip just missed the flesh of my leg, but he wasn't letting go now as the heavy material of my pants ripped slightly. I had no choice. I took one mighty bound with my weightless leg, catching the metal bumper, and pulled myself plus one overweight dog into the bed of the truck and plopped down between the crates full of milk bottles. Ivan looked me in the eye, blowing and wheezing, saliva dripping from his fleshy mouth. A growl arose from his chest. There was a fleck of blue here and there in his eyes, I noticed. But my friend, Old Joe Runs on Grass, taught me to never stare down a grizzly, a mama cow, or the old lady that ran the mercantile. So I turned my stare into a sideways glance, and the brute of a dog stopped rumbling. Attaboy. So Ivan accepts Maddie's invitation to join her on her adventure and becomes her constant companion, sometimes welcome, but most of the time showing up at the worst possible moments. Ivan was a chance to really have fun with a character that only expressed himself through action and was, I think, as an old soul in a dog's body, the perfect companion for Maddie. So when your research, experiences, and memories can't fill the gap, you have to imagine. Having grown up with a very active imagination, I'm pretty good at imagining things. But writing a plot and taking a small idea and turning it into a full-blown adventure is something else altogether. So I have the characters, I have the setting, I have a few ideas in my head that I call the what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? Then it becomes, why would it happen? And I have to start thinking about motivation. What makes each character act in a certain way? I'll make a list of possible things that can happen and refer back to them when I get stuck. It's all very broad at this point, but all I really want is to be pointed in the right direction. I write a lot of character sketches. The characters speak in their own voice and tell their own story. This is really fun because I get to leave my body and enter someone else's. And this gives me insights into what can logically happen and why it might. Voice is so important, and first person writing for me is the most interesting. So all my character sketches are done in first person, whether I use it in the story or not. And I use the writing program Scrivener in the early drafts and use its character templates to flesh out appearance, quirks, backstory, anything that I might need to refer back to. And it's really the voice in those first person sketches that I write that really takes me into unexpected directions and opens up new plot lines and makes writing exciting and satisfying for me. I'm really trying hard to do more outlining, but I find it difficult. So I just let the story unfold, at least at the beginning. And then when I'm a few chapters in, then I start looking ahead. And then I'll write out chapter notes so that I know what has to happen in this chapter, what's the emotional context of what's happening in this chapter, and gives me a place to go to the next chapter. Since I know the ending, my first step is to know the beginning and to know the ending. Those can change, but at this beginning stage, knowing where I'm going is really important to me. So I make sure that each chapter has a purpose in moving forward, both the plot and the emotional arc. And I basically ask the question, what happens in this chapter? How does it move the plot forward? And how does it affect the character emotionally? My process is constantly changing, but right now this is what works for me. And of course, as we've learned about historical fiction, it has its own set of rules, which has to be kept in mind at all times. Does the character realistically fit the period? I wanted Maddie to reflect a modern girl in many ways. I wanted to empower her with strength and heart, and I didn't want her to fall inside what was probably historically the average girl's place in society at that period of time. She had to rise beyond and yet be plausible and possible. Because to me, middle grade fiction is about the possibilities. So to wrap this up, with today's world being so all-consuming, so fast, so technologically driven, why do authors choose to set story in a slower historical past? There's no cell phones or internet or any of the social media young readers relate to every day. The technology of the past isn't ours, it's our grandpa's or even great-great-grandpa's worlds. But for me, writing with the framework of history gives me rules to observe, and that's a good thing. You have to stay in that period with period detail, and that also guides the story to some degree. Some things just can't happen. So for rule followers like me, there's a built-in frame to get you on the road. But I'm also a bit of a rebel, and making characters unusual, beyond their time or age, a little bit subversive, has an appeal to me as a writer and as a reader. So beyond that, to me, reading historical novels is like reading fantasy novels. They take you someplace you've never been and can never truly go. They transport you to a different time, and things are familiar and new all at the same time, even though they might be very old. It's time travel without having to deal with that pesky space-time continuum that's so annoying in science fiction. So there's a timeless quality to stories set in the past. I came across this quote from Fanny Sperry Steele after my book was completely done and with the publisher. And it validated for me that I at least had come close to getting Maddie's character right, because I think it speaks to this spirit of courage to go forward in life that I hoped Maddie would embody. When asked what it felt like to ride a bucking horse, Steele said, "You just forget about being scared when you ride a bucking horse. Think of staying on top, and perhaps you shall, some of the time. Just be thankful if you're able to get up and try it once more." Those are very wise words to live by. So, from historical fiction, we discover that no matter how long ago a person lived, that they, as a person, are not all that different from us. What they needed and enjoyed in the past is oftentimes what we need and enjoy today. Things like security, having friends and family around us, adventure. We all hurt and laugh just like Maddie and her friends who live in the story more than 100 years ago. Yes, today's challenges are different and scary and confusing, but we can learn from the past to face challenges with courage and resiliency. The core of who we are as humans, boys and girls, doesn't change with technology or passage of time. We love a good story, we laugh when our favorites do or say something funny or outrageous, and we relate and engage with characters that touch our hearts, no matter at what time in history they lived. Beyond that, everyone loves a good story, a beautiful horse, and a good dog. Are there any questions?
I have a question. How long did it take you to do all of this research? You must have been combing through the archives.
Yeah, I had lots of fits and starts with this, from health challenges to just giving up. And basically, I had given up on this before I sent it to Chicken Scratch Books. I honestly can't remember when I started, but I started by reading books about the cowgirls because I just found them so interesting. And so I had a little bit of background when Myrtle told me her story. And then that just triggered something. And then I just started getting more and more and just reading more and more. It sounds like there's a lot of information out there, but there isn't a lot available to someone like myself who's not a historian. So that's probably all I know that's up there. That's probably it. So yeah, I honestly can't say how many years it took me to write this book. But once I sent it off, I was very lucky that there was no major rewrite. There was just tweaking and adding a few things here and there and polishing. So it was probably well worth the time. Yeah.
Would you write another historical fiction, or would you set it contemporary and dispense with the research the next time?
I would love to write another Maddie book. I'm kind of working on one, but I have no expectations. It's just there, so it's just got to be written. So whether or not it's ever anyone sees it other than me, I don't really care. It's just Maddie lives on to me. She's just such a great character. But I do, as I was saying, I do have a magical realism book that I'm getting ready to try to send out now too. So it's not just historical. But it's fun. I think it's easier. I listen to people that write fantasies, and they talk about their world building process. And to me, that just seems like crazy hard work. You know, history has the framework.
You just have to find all the details.
Yeah.
And like, I really admire you for being so dedicated to getting like the time just right. You know, you didn't fudge 5 years here, 5 years there, and you wanted to know exactly what was happening in that particular year.
I'm really afraid of that email that says, "Man, you got that really wrong." So yes, I tried to do as much detail as I could. I worked in a newspaper, so I know you get criticized for, for little things. So yeah, it was pretty important to me to try to, and yet still at the same time, trying not to overwhelm the story. I read somewhere that historical fiction writers should use no more than 10% of the research that they actually find when writing an historical fiction.